The video autofocus in Sony's alpha cameras is an incredibly powerful tool that in recent years has really come into its own. But it's not something you just turn on and it will always work perfectly. You need to understand how everything from your camera, lens, settings, and filming situations play a huge part in getting incredible results. It's taken me a long time to master, but it's been worth it, as it's given me the ability to pull off shots in one take that would be incredibly hard to do with manual focus. I'm Philip Bloom, a filmmaker and director of photography from London, and I'm going to teach you how to master it.
If you've not seen part 1, then go watch that first, otherwise a lot of this won't make sense. As in part 1, when I refer to autofocus or AF, I am referring to video autofocus, not the photo one, which has many similarities, but many differences too. Using autofocus doesn't mean you should just sit back and let it do its thing. You actually have to think a lot more than if you're using manual focus.
I will again be using many different types of alpha cameras, but mostly focusing on the newer ones from the Alpha 7S3 onwards. But if you own one of the older cameras, most of this still applies to them. And as for the FX6 and FX9 cinema cameras, it absolutely does. In part 1 we got our cameras set up with the custom keys and the function menu, then it was the basics followed by AFS and touch focus. Continuous autofocus, otherwise known as AFC, is what we use for all forms of tracking. This is where things can get complicated and fiddly.
Knowing what the right settings are is very important, but so is being in full control. So if you see something that could throw the AF system or just look bad, you can stop it before it happens.
This is why you need to learn what I call manual autofocus. This is when we use autofocus but quickly adjust settings, switch to another mode, but also importantly, switch to manual focus briefly when we need to.
There are many ways to do this, all via the custom buttons that I set up in part 1. Don't use the AF/MF switch on your lens, as this will guarantee unwanted camera movement. The custom key which I set to AF/MF toggle literally switches between AF and MF each time you press it. This is great when you want to keep your AF turned off for more than a brief moment, otherwise you are pressing it twice, once to turn it off and then again turn it back on. I generally use this method when filming with a tripod. Focus hold is what I used to use the most, but I don't use it anymore. It's set to the button on the lens. It temporarily disengages AF whilst you hold it, and the moment you release it, AF turns on again. When shooting handheld, my favourite way is to use the AF/MF selector hold custom button, as it makes you feel the most in control. When in continuous autofocus, it works just like focus hold. AF disengages when it's held down and then is re-engaged when you release it. What makes this better than focus hold is that it works the other way round too. When you're in manual focus and you hold it down, then continuous autofocus engages and you will stay on it until you release the button, taking you instantly back to manual focus. This is such a lovely way to operate AF when handheld. I only engage AF when a subject is moving or I want to grab a new subject, otherwise it stays in manual focus mode, which avoids any potential problems or distractions.
But there is a very important thing that you must understand if you want to control autofocus this way. The AF/MF hold function only works like I showed you when you switch between autofocus and manual focus using the focus mode selector setting that I've put in the function menu. So for example, I have set focus mode to AFC here. I then use the AF/MF toggle to change it to MF. What I want to happen is for the AF/MF hold button to temporarily switch to AFC whilst pressed down, but it doesn't change. And when I let go, it defaults back to what focus mode is set to, AFC. Conversely, if you set focus mode to manual focus and then change it to AFC with that toggle button, Then again, nothing happens when you try to use the AF/MF focus hold, releasing it once more defaults to what we have our focus mode set to. This is why I have focus mode in the shortcut menu, as well as having an AF/MF toggle shortcut key. AF/MF toggle is a great way to quickly disengage autofocus with one button press. Think of the focus mode function as a dial or switch, and the AF/MF toggle as an override. In fact, the Alpha 1 doesn't even have an option for focus mode in the menu because it actually does have a dial that does this. I really hope that makes sense.
A new and really useful addition to the Sony autofocus system that was introduced with the A7 IV is AF Assist. When in AFC mode, when you move the focus ring, it overrides the autofocus so you can change the focus to where you want it to be. And as soon as you let go of it, AFC re-engages. Once you've used it when shooting with autofocus, it becomes a fantastic way to give you additional control. And the more control we have over AF, the easier it is to use. There are three main ways that the camera tracks focus. The most commonly used ones are face eye tracking and touch tracking. But before I get onto those, let's look at the most basic way first. In continuous autofocus mode with the area set to wide, the camera decides what to keep in focus. It will generally pick the most prominent thing in the frame, size or distance. It may also choose something moving. Even though you haven't specifically chosen the subject, it will effectively track it. This isn't the best way to use AF as you are leaving things up to chance, and when you do that, that's when things tend to go wrong. Sometimes though it does wonders, like here.
Changing your focus area to something smaller than wide, like zones, and especially flexible spot, let you narrow down what the camera is looking at, removing a lot of the guesswork as to what you want it to track. When we're doing any sort of tracking, the most important setting comes into play: subject shift sensitivity. AF transition speed also plays a part, especially in combination with it. But that sensitivity is absolutely key, and it will be a big factor in everything that I will show you from now on. I use high sensitivity and fast speed on a wide area here because I was filming at 240 frames per second. Whilst that speed looked ugly to the eye whilst filming it, when played back with this super slow motion, it looked like a nice normal focus rack. What I'm going to tell you about these settings goes against what I said in my reviews of the FX9, the Alpha 7S III and the FX6. It was during the filming of these videos that what I thought they did wasn't quite right, and it took a number of shoots and reshoots for these videos for me to finally fully understand them. Once your camera fully locks onto a subject, and only whilst fully locked onto a subject, these settings don't play a part in how well the camera tracks that subject. This is the same with any of the Sony Alpha cameras, starting with the Alpha 6400 in early 2019. For cameras before this, like the Alpha 7 III, then the autofocus behaves very differently in video, as the settings play a key part in keeping your subject in focus all the time, as it doesn't lock onto them in the same way, even in face tracking. Let's get our camera set up for face and eye tracking.
You need to make sure you are in face priority mode. Remember, I have set this to one of the custom buttons, because you often want to be able to quickly turn it on or off depending on what you are filming. I also recommend turning on the setting to display the face and eye tracking box. After all, you want to know that it's working.
You also need to make sure you're set to a human subject, because even if your camera doesn't support video autofocus for animals, it will stay on that setting even in movie mode. Whether you're set to the highest sensitivity and fastest speed, or in the least sensitive and slowest speed, the autofocus stays locked onto Sarah's eye. What happens when it loses her eye is where the settings kick in. with them both at the highest, when she exits the frame, the focus will immediately jump onto the background. When we bring the speed down but leave the sensitivity at the highest, it still immediately starts to rack onto the background, but it does it slowly. Now with the slowest speed and lowest sensitivity, when she exits frame, there is a delay before it moves to the background. The sensitivity setting is literally how sensitive it is to what's happening in the frame. The best way to stop the autofocus racking onto the background is to use manual autofocus. As I'm on a tripod, I use the AF/MF toggle key here. At the point I want the AF to stop working and stay where it is, I press this button. Manual focus. Much better than racking to the background. The sensitivity also plays a big part in how quickly it will acquire your subject. As Sarah emerges from behind the tree at 1 and 1, it doesn't grab her. Even though there is a white face tracking box, this doesn't mean it's locked onto her. It just means that it's trying to track her face. With more time, it would have found her, but the shot is ruined anyway. Now, there are two reasons why this happened. The obvious one is because we started with her behind the tree. And what added to this was the starting focus point was behind her. If I'd set it to the tree, which would have been the obvious place to put it, then as she entered that plane of focus when she merged, then it would have grabbed her easily. It's the sensitivity that is key. Sensitivity at 1 is what I would call the very stubborn AF mode. And I use it a lot, especially for talking heads. It's just if the AF loses the subject, it may be too stubborn to reacquire it. In these shots, at 1 and 1, I start with focus locked onto her, which is instantly going to help. When she walks behind the trees, because we are set to stubborn sensitivity, it won't move onto the tree, but it does lose her eye occasionally. When she fully appears from behind the tree, it manages to grab her again. If you try and do this shot with a fast sensitivity, the results are not good at all. As soon as it loses her, it goes straight onto the tree. When using tracking, remember the 4 S's. Sensitivity, sensitivity, and sometimes speed. With the older cameras, you don't have the luxury of 5 levels of sensitivity, just the 2. But to be honest, I pretty much just use 1, 2, and 5. Remember, it's that eye lock that we want, because that's when the AF is really nice and sticky. But she's too far away for the camera to get it, so I help the AF out. Because she is smaller in the frame for most of the shot, I have to keep helping it with touch tracking. When you engage this, it immediately overrides the sensitivity. Be ready to take control if you see something that isn't working the way you want it to. The key to successful autofocus is mastering that control through manual autofocus.
It's good. We've got it, we've got it. And off we go. Yes, we got it, well done.
There are times when I want to start filming with face priority on and then turn it off, if needed, and vice versa. But most of the cameras lock this function once you start rolling. The ability to switch whilst recording is something that has been added recently to Sony's video autofocus, which is great because the more control we have, the better. I have both my speed and sensitivity set to very high at the start of this shot, and the AF jumps to different people very quickly. But when I spot the jogger, I changed them so I can track him and not get distracted by anything.
With so many faces and other distractions in this shot, the only way I could keep on the jogger was to bring the sensitivity right down. The problem is, if you start with a slow speed and minimum sensitivity, the AF will be slow to detect anything. It's even worse when you're filming people. By the time it locks on, you may have missed them.
When there are numerous faces in the frame, you will see multiple face boxes, but there's no way to cycle through these with the joystick. Use touch tracking to tell it which face you want. When it gets close enough, it will switch to a face box and then the eye one. But make sure you have a nice low sensitivity to stop it from jumping to another person, which it might do. With a wide area setting, the AF will pick up the most prominent face in the frame, and with a nice stubborn sensitivity, it will hopefully stay on them and not move on to anyone else, even if they get bigger in the frame. Hopefully. With a high sensitivity, it absolutely will move on to them. You could change the focus area and then move it over the person you want it to track. It will not look at the rest of the frame, just that area. But generally a nice low sensitivity will do the trick on this sort of shot. Just be prepared to take control. Manual autofocus.
There we go. Now there is a face registration mode in cameras that has been around for a while. It's not the best, but it is there and can be useful at times. It's a bit fiddly to use, both with the new and old cameras. You have to go into the AF stills part of the menu and register a face by taking their photo and saving it in the memory. You can have multiple faces in there and set the order or preference. Then in the video AF settings, you turn on face registration priority, and if your registered face is seen, it will focus on them rather than any other ones. Faces seen that aren't registered, or if you are on your priority face and there are lower ones in the list which you can see, and they will have a purple box. Read Sarah's face, and it should come onto me now. It takes a while because I'm locked on mode. The main issue is with this, other than the clunky way that you operate it, is that the registered face is straight on, so when your subject isn't quite straight on, it may not recognise them straight away.
The FX6 and FX9 have a face-only mode that will literally only engage autofocus when it sees a face or eye. If it doesn't, then it disengages until it can see them again. It's a nice feature and something I use when filming with my FX6. When I'm filming a talking head, I will pretty much always be on 1 and 1. Having a super stubborn AF is very important. When Sarah covers her eye, it loses that lock, but the AF does really well to not move off of her. With a high sensitivity and still in eye tracking, it's pretty obvious what will happen. There are of course times when we want to move on to something we hold up. If you're operating, just use touch focus to change to the object. If you are filming yourself, then you'll need to either cover over your eye with it in eye tracking or turn it off. If you're going to show anything to camera like this, then there is only one sensitivity setting you should be at, and that is 5. We want it to notice the change immediately, and the speed is very important to make it look nice and natural. Generally 2, 3 and 4 work well, but that depends on the lens, camera depth of field, and how far away it is from the lens. If it's set too fast, it can look very unnatural. And if it's set too slow, it can look too slow. If you lower the sensitivity, then it looks like you have a focus puller with slow reactions. The golden rules here are always have sensitivity at 5 with an appropriate speed for showing something to camera, and if you aren't holding something up, as in just straight interviews, then just leave it at 1. You don't want that focus to shift off of the person you're filming. And it won't, because when I said this is stubborn, yeah, this setting is really stubborn at shifting off of them.
Stubborn mode. Lock-on mode.
Depending on your lens and how close you are to the camera, the focus breathing can be quite ugly when it racks, just like when we did touch focus racks in part 1. Once again, the breathing control of the A7 IV here does wonders. Yes, there's a slight crop for it to be able to do this, but it's absolutely worth it. How much it crops depends. Further into the distance you focus, the more it needs to crop. There is no crop at minimum focus, and at about 10 to 12% at infinity. Animal video autofocus works very well on the cameras that I've tested it with. You of course need to select it in the menu. On the A7 IV here, I have it in the function menu, as it is something I use a lot. It seems to be as sticky as it is with humans, but if it loses the eye, then it won't switch to a face box. It only has eye tracking. What is interesting is sometimes my cameras without animal eye AF in video do work in human mode.
So Sarah is a human. Moo. So's Moo. Millie. But no, Millie I have to select as an animal. And then Moo. She's an animal too. And then Sarah is... No, she's got to be human.
If your camera doesn't have animal eye tracking in video, do what I do and use touch tracking. It's not quite as good, but it will do for now. What you've learned already about how the settings work in other modes is exactly the same with touch tracking. For most of the examples with the alpha cameras, I can only show you the recordings due to the LCD screen turning off if you output the on-screen display out of the HDMI, which kills the touch operation. With the Sony FX6 and FX9, thankfully this doesn't happen and the LCD screen stays on, as does touch tracking. Touch tracking is very simple in concept. Touch the subject you want and let the camera's AF track them. The sensitivity and speed settings play no part in how well the subject is tracked, which you should know by now. But just like all forms of tracking, it's what happens if it loses the subject. Touch tracking is not as sticky as eye tracking, so the settings are very important. Well, they are for every mode. Being in control is very important. You don't want this to happen, do you? The nice and stubborn sensitivity of 1 will help you not lose your subject when there are distractions, but also switching to manual focus briefly is something I do very often with shots like this. Sometimes though, trying to make touch tracking work is harder than just using manual focus. Autofocus is fantastic for the right situation. It's just not for everything. I guarantee you, even when you've mastered autofocus, there is still going to be times when you will miss the shot because of the autofocus, which you would have got had you been in manual focus. When you're tracking a subject and you want to cancel it, you can either press the icon on the screen with a little X, press the center button of the dial, or quickly turn autofocus off and on again with the AF/MF toggle button. If you have a camera that has AF assist, if you turn the focus ring, it will also cancel the tracking. Which focus area you're in doesn't matter when using touch focus until it loses your subject, at which point it will revert to what it was set to. The one thing that autofocus can't replicate is that natural organic feel you get when you slightly dip in and out of focus. The natural imperfections that only manual focus can give you, which can work so beautifully, especially when shooting handheld. There are occasions that perfect autofocus can look too clinical for certain types of filming. Yes, I am actually saying the Sony autofocus system is sometimes too good, and using manual focus is still a huge part of my filming.
But the problem is, with autofocus lenses, they just don't have hard stops, which means infinity and minimum focus have no defined places on the focus ring. There is also the problem that most Sony lenses have focus by wire rather than linear response, although this is changing with their newer ones. With focus by wire, when you turn the focus barrel slowly, the amount you have to rotate is much more than if you move it quickly. For example, infinity to minimum focus could be about 180-degree rotation when moving it slowly, but at speed could be as little as 30 degrees. This makes doing muscle memory focus racks very difficult. It also means you never really get a feel for manual focus with your lens. With linear manual focus, when you turn the focus ring, the focus will always move the same amount. This makes manual focusing so much easier. The lens will also have a set focus rotation. For example, the Sony 35mm f1.4 has a focus rotation of 120 degrees, which is a nice amount for this type of lens.
These two videos are full of my tips and tricks to getting great results, but I wanted to finish off with some more specific troubleshooting. This is a really basic autofocus tracking subject, a stationary old Sony PC90 Handycam, in profile as well, giving it a nice easy thing to grab. Just like all the tracking modes, once it has locked onto its subject, the speed and sensitivity don't affect how well it is tracked. But if I move onto it and start moving straight away before it's locked on, as I'm constantly moving, it really struggles.
Hold.
But if you just take a brief moment to pause, then it's locked on and we are good. Our sensitivity and speed can sometimes help give the camera a quicker lock, but not always. I didn't even need to pause on this shot with the Alpha 1 with the lock-on sensitivity of 1 and speed of 1. It's inconsistent, that's why the pause can really help things out. With the older autofocus system that the Alpha 7 III uses, it doesn't work in the same way, even when I pause. It cannot get an actual tracking lock. The tracking sensitivity does make a difference here, but even at the highest of the two settings, it just cannot keep up with my fast movement. When using touch tracking, sometimes I didn't need to briefly pause, and sometimes I did. The frustrating thing is the only way you know you have that lock is when you see that your autofocus is working. There is no indicator to tell you that it hasn't perfectly grabbed it, whether in basic tracking or touch tracking.
Now, Sony's autofocus is called hybrid autofocus, using both phase detection and contrast. Phase detection is super fast, but not always pinpoint accurate, and contrast AF is slower, but is more accurate. By using them in combination with each other, you get the best of both worlds.
The two systems need various things to work properly. Light, contrast on objects, patterns for example. Anything that can help it tell the difference between subjects and give it something to lock onto. Having a subject with no real contrast or patterns can make it really struggle. I have the focus area set to zone to cover the entrance to this self-cleaning litter box, with animal eye autofocus on. The idea being when the cats use it to stick their heads out of it, the autofocus will shift from the machine to them. The problem is when it goes into a cleaning cycle, then it just becomes this white solid object with nothing to lock onto. By changing it to wide zone and adding the stickers, I am giving the autofocus a pattern to use. The difference is huge. Not that I'm saying if you are having issues focusing on a subject, just go and slap a sticker on it. Touch tracking in the large flexible spot mode that I use here just can't cope with Jimmy. He's just too much of a dark subject here with no difference for the contrast to grab onto. So I switched to manual focus. In a different spot, with more even lighting, absolutely fine. It's interesting to know that when Lollipop went to that same spot, it had no issues. Dark objects against bright backgrounds are very problematic.
As it is looking for the part of the subject with the most contrast when shooting in the very flat S-Log profiles, which have very little contrast, it can struggle at times, although with the more recent cameras, this has become less of an issue.
Tracking subjects in high ISOs is totally achievable. It's much harder for it, of course, but it does work. But there are things to watch out for. I tried to touch and eye track Sarah about half a dozen times here. What was the biggest problem? Well, the shadows didn't help, but headlights were what really threw it. Eventually, I got a break in the traffic and got the shot. Knowing what can cause issues can save you time and stop the talent getting annoyed with you.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can get a pulsing or twitching when filming talking heads. Most commonly, this is because your subject is close at lens and you are shooting with a shallow depth of field. Every little movement they make causes the autofocus to move. And because of the focus breathing of the lens, you are getting what actually looks like lots of super quick micro zooms.
The new focus breathing control does wonders at hiding this, as you won't see the pulsing anymore when it's turned on. It's a hugely impressive innovation for autofocus, as breathing happens in just about every stills lens.
As you cannot dial back your settings to slow the AF down when using eye tracking, you could move your subject further away from the camera, which will increase the depth of field and maybe even stop down a bit too.
If you've got a busy background, especially with bokeh balls, it will be especially noticeable.
In this really bad example, the focus is pinging to the background and back again. If your sensitivity and speed is high and fast, then it can easily do this, especially with some bright backgrounds. That's why I strongly recommend filming talking heads with the slowest speed and a nice low sensitivity. Also, using a zone of flexible spots will help, so it's only tracking the face and nasty light can't interfere with it. The goal with autofocus is to make it look like manual focus, just done really, really well. Hopefully this video has shown you exactly how it behaves, so when you are using it, you know how to get the best results.
The best advice I can give you is to just get your camera set up like I showed you and be in full control. Manual autofocus is the key. Don't just turn it on and hope for the best, because the best won't happen. Autofocus is an art that takes a lot of practice to get right, but it does help you enormously. Getting back to fully manual focus cameras and lenses is fine, as I'm so used to them, but I really miss AF when I do. The Sony autofocus system has truly spoiled me, but I like to be spoiled.